So we have just finished studying the time period 1200 to 1450. Now we're going to move into the new time period 1450 to 1750. And we're going to start with European exploration. So that's one of the things that kind of divides these two time periods, is that in the 1400s, Europeans started interacting a lot more with other parts of the world. In this PowerPoint, we're going to do things a little bit differently, and it's going to ask you to record information on your key concepts. So if you haven't already, go to the key concepts folder and open up the key concepts for 1450 to 1750. And then you're just going to follow along on that page and go to the different key concepts that are included in the PowerPoint and record some information. So 4.1a says knowledge, scientific learning, and technology from the classical, Islamic, and Asian world spread, facilitating European technological developments and innovation. So this is really getting at the idea of why did Europeans start exploring in this particular time period? And it's because of all this technology and information that they got from other cultures. So we've been talking about a lot of these things as related to, say, Indian Ocean trade or some of the African or Asian civilizations. But these things now made it to Europe, and Europeans were able to start exploring. So things like knowledge of monsoons, currents, and winds, and then a lot of the scientific learning and technology that we've already looked at. So like the astrolabe originally came from the Greeks, the compass from China, astronomy from Chinese and Islamic scholars, the Latin sail, which is the triangular sail, Islamic knowledge from Al-Andalus, which was Muslim Spain, and gunpowder from China. And so Europeans borrowed these different technologies or kind of incorporated them into what they were already doing, and that enabled Europeans to go explore at this time. Okay, 4.1b. The developments included in the production of new tools, innovations in ship designs, and an improved understanding of regional wind and current patterns, all of which made transoceanic travel and trade possible. So Europeans continued to get more technology. This one is talking specifically about ships. So the sternpost rudder from China is pictured on the left. Remember, a rudder is the thing that moves at the back of the ship to steer the ship. Caravels with lateen sails was a new ship design. Think of the type of ship you kind of picture of like Christopher Columbus being on. That's a caravel. And the flute, which is pictured on the right, was developed specifically by the Dutch to carry lots and lots of products. So a lot of the earlier ship designs were just military ships that they converted to carry cargo, but the flute was designed specifically just to be a cargo ship, to be able to be used for trade and carrying lots of products. And this map shows you the importance of understanding the currents and wind patterns. And so once Europeans figured this stuff out, it made it a lot easier for them to travel throughout the world. So let's just use, for example, look at Europe and Africa, and then the Atlantic Ocean, and then the Americas. So say you're coming from Europe, and you want to go to the Americas. If you look at like Spain, and you travel down, you're going to go, if you want to follow the currents, you want to go south along the west coast of Africa and then cut across, and it'll take you over to the Caribbean area naturally. Then if you want to go back, the best way is to sail north and go across the North Atlantic if you want the currents to carry you. So understanding how these things worked enabled Europeans to make these voyages like much, much more easily. And again, a lot of this knowledge diffused from other parts of the world. So 4.1c is new state-supported transoceanic maritime exploration occurred in this period. The key thing here is state-supported, meaning that the government is going to fund it. So transoceanic voyages are very, very expensive, and a lot of people who wanted to explore or wanted to go trade couldn't afford to actually set that up and like get a ship and get men to work on the ship and all these things without state sponsorship. And so the first two states that really led the way in exploration were Portugal and then Spain. And both of those were countries that used state sponsorship. So other countries later joined in, England, Netherlands, France. But Portugal and then Spain were the first where their monarchs paid to set up voyages for exploration. And they did this because they hoped that they would be able to claim land, extend their power, and hopefully set up trade relationships where they could make a profit. So 4.1D, Portuguese development of maritime technology and navigational skills led to increased travel to and trade with Africa and Asia and resulted in the construction of a global trading post empire. So, like I said just a minute ago, Portugal was the first European country to really start exploring the world. And as it says in this key concept, they started with the west coast of Africa and eventually made it to Asia and eventually set up a global trading post empire. So why would Portugal be the leader of sea trade in Europe? Well, if you look at the map, Portugal is right on the coast. It's on the Mediterranean or close to the Mediterranean and right on the Atlantic Ocean. And so Portugal had a long tradition of sailing and fishing and like understanding of those kinds of things. And so that really aided Portugal in being the first. This guy who's pictured, Prince Henry the Navigator, was a wealthy man from Portugal who sponsored some of the first explorers from Portugal to go down the west coast of Africa. And the reason he did this is that they were searching for a route to get to Asia. So up until this point, Europeans, they really liked Asian products and luxury goods, but they didn't have a direct way to trade with Asia because in the middle between Europeans and Asia was the Middle East, which was controlled by groups like the Abbasids and other Muslim empires. And so if Europeans wanted to get Asian products, they had to go through that area of the world, and then they were paying more money because they'd like mark up the products. So they wanted to have their own way to get to Asia. This map I like because it really shows how Europeans saw the world. They knew that Africa existed, but they had no idea how big it was, if you could really sail around it, anything like that. And so you can see the area kind of marks the unknown. They didn't really know what was down there. And so the voyages set up by Prince Henry started to sail down the coast of Africa to try to explore and see if it would be possible to get around Africa and get to Asia. Prince Henry also set up a navigational school in Portugal to train future explorers. So the school taught people about like all the new navigational technology and things that they would need to be successful. And eventually, the Portuguese did make it. So Bartholomew Diaz sailed around the southern tip of Africa in 1448, and he went down to the Cape of Good Hope and then turned around. But that proved that you could make it to the bottom of Africa. And then Vasco da Gama in 1498 sailed around Africa, and then you can see he cut across the Indian Ocean over to India. This was huge because it showed that you could get to Asia by sailing around Africa, and Vasco da Gama loaded up a bunch of Asian products, including spices, and came back to Portugal, and they were sold, and they made a ton of money. And so this started the Portuguese like a big rush to make it to Asia, to start getting Asian products directly and selling them back in Europe and making lots and lots of profit. The Portuguese also set up trading posts in Asia in places like Malacca that we learned about in Southeast Asia and in India. And to maintain this, they built forts to defend their trade interests. It's important to note that in this time, they were just trying to establish trading posts. They were not trying to take over or form colonies in these other places. So it's not like they were trying to send a bunch of Portuguese people to Asia to try to set up colonies. They were really just there to trade. What they wanted was to monopolize trade in the Indian Ocean. So they wanted to be like the only group that could trade in the Indian Ocean. And they tried to force other merchants in the Indian Ocean to buy passes to be able to trade. They were later overtaken by the Dutch in Asia, who were better financed. So even though the Portuguese were kind of the leaders of Asian trade at first among Europeans, they were overtaken by the Dutch. So 4.1e, Spanish sponsorship of the voyages of Columbus and subsequent voyages across the Atlantic and Pacific dramatically increased European interest in transoceanic travel and trade. So Columbus took 4 voyages to the Americas searching for a route to Asia. So it's kind of a lot of people learn, I feel like in elementary school or somewhere, that people thought the earth was flat and all this, and that's really not true. Columbus and lots of other people knew that the earth was round. But what they didn't know is the size of it or where all the land was located or things like that. And so Columbus believed that he could get to Asia relatively quickly by sailing west. But of course, he had no idea that there were continents in the middle. And so he never realized that he was not there. He thought he was on the islands of Southeast Asia and just couldn't quite find the way to mainland Asia, which of course was not true. Ferdinand Magellan attempted to circumnavigate the globe and claim land for Spain. He actually took over the Philippines for Spain, and Manila in the Philippines became a major center of Spanish trade. Here's a map that shows the route of Magellan. So he was supposed to claim land for Spain in Asia. People in Europe didn't fully know what the geography of Asia looked like. And so he was sent over there to try to lay claim to some territory. So you can see he went through South America. He crossed over through the little strait at the tip of South America, which is now called the Strait of Magellan. He was trying to find a shortcut to Asia, which does not exist really until the Panama Canal was built. And then he went across the Pacific, claimed the Philippines, where he was actually murdered, but then the rest of his surviving crew, sailed back. So 4.1F, North Atlantic crossings were undertaken under English, French, and Dutch sponsorship, often with the goal of finding alternative sailing routes to Asia. So some specific examples: John Cabot, who was from England, searched for a Northwest Passage. A Northwest Passage was, again, they're still looking for a shortcut across the Americas. So they realized there wasn't one in South America, so they kept trying to find a route across North America, which of course does not exist either. But this eventually led England to having claims in the Americas, such as Jamestown. Another example is Jacques Cartier from France, who also searched for a Northwest Passage. He made it all the way through the St. Lawrence River and then realized it didn't lead to Asia. But this led France to claim the what is today Canadian territory of Quebec. Another example is the Netherlands, who sent Henry Hudson. He also was searching for a Northwest Passage. This led the Dutch to claim the Hudson Valley, which is part of today modern-day New York, and establish New Amsterdam. So the Dutch are actually the founders of New York City. It was later overtaken by the British, which is why it was changed to New York. So other goals besides the Northwest Passage, people came to the Americas for the trade of furs, and then also just for land, because most of the land in Europe by this point was all taken. And so they wanted places where they could establish large farming areas for products such as tobacco. Another example of somebody who explored was James Cook, who explored for England. He is most known for exploring the Pacific, and I don't like to use the word discovered because there were already people living in all these places, but for European minds, he discovered all these islands in the Pacific, like Hawaii and Tahiti, New Zealand, Australia. So he traveled all throughout the Pacific. So 4.1L, the new connections between the eastern and western hemispheres resulted in the exchange of new plants, animals, and diseases known as the Columbian Exchange. So the Columbian Exchange is when Europeans came in contact with Americans, and then they exchanged different things, such as plants, animals, and diseases. It's not trade, they're not doing this for a profit. The Columbian Exchange is just describing the initial meeting, and then they learn about stuff from the other culture. So I put a star next to the ones that I think are most significant for you to know. So let's go from the Americas to Europe. Things such as tobacco, peppers, peanuts, potatoes, tomatoes, corn, cacao or chocolate. None of those things were in Afro-Eurasia before they had contact, but like before exploration. And I think think about like some of the cuisines from Afro-Eurasia that use those foods. So like tomatoes, for example, we really associate with Italian food and pizza. Did not exist until after Columbus. Potatoes, you might know about like the Irish potato famine, did not exist until after Columbus. Peppers, if you think about different kinds of spicy foods often associated with like Asian cuisine, was not there before this contact. And then going the other way from Europe and Africa towards the Americas, things like coffee, bananas, sugar, wheat, rice, a lot of animals, cattle, sheep, pigs, horses, and a lot of diseases, smallpox, influenza, measles, and also disease-carrying animals like rats and mosquitoes. So coffee, bananas, sugar are all products that are today really associated with Latin America. They are not native to there. They did not come there until exploration. Think about cows and how like ubiquitous ranching is where we live. Did not exist before then. Think about horses. Even if you picture in your mind like Native Americans on horses on the Great Plains, did not exist before Europeans came. So the Columbian Exchange is huge for the exchange of all these new plants, animals, and diseases. So 4.1M, European colonization of the Americas led to the unintentional transfer of disease vectors, including mosquitoes and rats, and the spread of diseases that were endemic to the Eastern Hemisphere, including smallpox, measles, and malaria. Some of these diseases substantially reduced the indigenous populations with catastrophic effects in many areas. So mosquitoes and rats both carry disease. We learned about rats, for example, like with the bubonic plague, but mosquitoes carry a lot of diseases and then they bite people and then you can get those diseases, like malaria is a good example. So those are what we call disease vectors, or like things that transfer disease. Smallpox, measles, and malaria killed a huge percentage of the native people of the Americas. Some historians estimate like as high as 95%. This occurred because they had no natural immunities to those diseases. And we're going to learn more about this as we go further into this unit. But people over time who had been exposed to those diseases, some people had some immunities to them and might get sick, but then like more easily recover. Because the Native Americans had never been exposed to those diseases, because the continents were totally separate, they died in really, really high percentages. And then it says, populations in Afro-Eurasia benefited nutritionally from the increased diversity of North American food crops. And that is actually letter N. So potatoes and corn became especially popular in Europe. So that's an example of an American food that became a staple crop. Potatoes really benefited Afro-Eurasia nutritionally because potatoes have a lot of calories. And so today, if people are trying to lose weight, for example, sometimes they might like avoid carbs or things like potatoes. And that's because they tend to have a lot of calories. But in this time period, where most people are just trying to survive and like have enough calories to live, that was a really good thing to have a food that had a lot of calories in it. And so potatoes became really, really widely grown throughout Afro-Eurasia and really helped increase the population of Afro-Eurasia. Now we're going to go all the way to 4.3F. Europeans established new trading posts in Africa and Asia, which proved profitable for the rulers and merchants involved in new global trade networks. Some Asian states sought to limit the disruptive economic and cultural effects of European-dominated long-distance trade by adopting restrictive or isolationist policies. So, first of all, the difference between a trading post empire and a colony. So, trading posts, they're just there to trade. A colony is when you're actually sending people from your home country to the new place to like establish a new home. So, not everybody wanted to trade with Europeans. So remember how the Ming dynasty in China stopped the voyages of Zheng He? The Ming tried to limit foreign trade and didn't believe they had anything to gain from Europeans. So for an example of a Asian state that limited the effects, Ming dynasty is definitely one. They produced a lot of the luxury products that other people wanted, like porcelain and silk. The Europeans didn't really have a lot of products that the Chinese wanted. Japan is another one that initially traded with the Portuguese and Dutch, but eventually tried to limit trade. So that's another one you can put as an example of an Asian state that limited the effects. Japan was initially really open, and then after a lot of Europeans came and a lot of Christian missionaries came, some people started to feel like Japanese traditional culture was being disrupted, and they didn't like that. And so eventually Japan became much more closed off to European contact. So here's some examples of trading posts throughout the world. So the Dutch are the purple dots. You can see the Dutch had a lot of trading posts in Southeast Asia and what is today Indonesia. And that's where a lot of the world's spices came from, which is one thing that Europeans were really, really after. The Spanish, you can see, had the Philippines. That was their major area of Asia. And then in India, we see a whole mix of people at this time. English and French and Portuguese and a little bit of Dutch. You can also see the Portuguese traded in Macau in China, and the Dutch traded in Japan. And again, both of those countries over time tried to limit the impact of Europeans. Driven largely, so this is 4.3J, driven largely by political, religious, and economic rivalries, European states established new maritime empires, including the Portuguese, Spanish, Dutch, French, and British. So all you're supposed to do here is list the places that they controlled. So you might want to just kind of pause the video and do that. One thing I'll point out to you, because it's can be hard to see, is remember the Philippines way over there in the Pacific, the islands are controlled by the Spanish. There's just a little dot of orange on this map, so that can be hard. So what I would do is just pause the video and list the areas. And it doesn't have to be super detailed. Like the Spanish, you could say North America and Latin America, things like that. So go ahead and pause it and then continue. So 4.3H, despite some disruption and restructuring due to the arrival of Portuguese, Spanish, and Dutch merchants, existing trade networks in the Indian Ocean continued to flourish and included intra, which means between Asian trade and Asian merchants. So what is that saying? It's saying even though the Portuguese, Spanish, and Dutch came and they really tried to trade, and they did trade, that doesn't mean that all the other Asian trade just stopped in the Indian Ocean. The Portuguese tried to use military force, like gunpowder weapons, often to defeat groups and take over trade, but they certainly did not monopolize it as they had hoped to do. All of those different groups we learned that were trading in the Indian Ocean continued, and Asian states continued to trade directly with each other, like not even having anything to do with the Portuguese, Spanish, or Dutch. And then 4.1H, regional markets continued to flourish in Afro-Eurasia by using established commercial practices and new transoceanic and regional shipping services developed by European merchants. So again, that's saying Europeans didn't dominate the whole thing. Throughout the Indian Ocean, Arabs, Indians, Southeast Asians continued to conduct their own trade, and their trade even grew due to new innovations. The increased output of manufacturing led to an overall increased volume of products to trade. So groups like the Arabs, Indians, Southeast Asians continued even as Europeans came in and tried to really take over and dominate. Okay, 4.1 I and J. Mercantilist policies and practices were used by European rulers to expand and control their economies and claim overseas territories. Joint stock companies, influenced by these mercantilist principles, were used by rulers and merchants to finance exploration and were used by rulers to compete against one another in global trade. So I'm going to come back to mercantilism in a minute. Let's look at letter J. Joint stock companies owned by investors who bought stock or shares in a company that sponsored a voyage of exploration of settlement. So basically, joint stock companies spread the risk and profit among many people rather than one. It also offers limited liability, or the idea that a person is not legally responsible should the company fail. So think about it this way. If you are going to sponsor a voyage, it's very, very risky. The ship could easily sink, like all kinds of things could happen, and you just totally lose your investment. And so even the wealthy monarchs of Europe, like the Spanish and the Portuguese, they don't have completely unlimited money. And so we said that Portuguese and the Spanish were state-sponsored, but even they started to run out of ways to finance these voyages. And so what a joint stock company does is it pools money. So like say everybody in our class put in money to sponsor a voyage, we all only have to put in a little bit. And then if the ship sinks and it doesn't make it and we lose everything, we all just lose a little bit of money rather than one person losing all of it. So joint stock companies were a better way in a lot of ways to finance these voyages because they were less risky. Also, if something happened, the company was responsible, not you as an individual. That's what the limited liability means. So these were especially popular among the British, French, and Dutch. This allowed them to pull ahead of the Portuguese and Spanish, who were mostly state-sponsored only. So when this Portuguese and Spanish started to run out of money, the British, French, and Dutch could really pull ahead with their joint stock companies. A lot of times the joint stock companies were granted monopolies to trade on behalf of the nation, and they're given really like a lot of power to make war or do like whatever is necessary. So think about a private company being able to do whatever they want, even like kill people if they have to make trade happen. That's really what's going on with joint stock companies. And two good examples are the British East India Company and the Dutch East India Company. The Dutch East India Company is often referred to as the VOC because that's like the acronym in Dutch. So if you see Dutch VOC, that's a joint stock company. Okay, mercantilism. So the key concept for I references mercantilism. Mercantilism is an economic theory that students often have trouble understanding. So I try to give a little illustration here. This illustration is going to use the Americas as the example of the colonies, but this could apply to any colony throughout the world. It could apply to African colonies, Asian colonies, it doesn't matter. Okay, here are the key principles of mercantilism. Mercantilism says you need to have a favorable balance of trade, meaning that you export more than you import. You need to get lots of gold and silver, which is also referred to as bullion. So gold and silver, Europeans believed at the time, was like the major measure of wealth. And you want to be self-sufficient. You don't want to have to depend on any other European countries who are your rivals. Mercantilists also believe that the amount of the wealth in the world is finite. So think about that. If you really believe that the amount of wealth in the world is limited and it's finite, and there's only so much to go around, you're going to want to try to get as much as you can before other people do. And so this led to a lot of competition as Europeans went out and tried to grab as much territory and wealth as they could. So here's kind of an example of how mercantilism would work. The European country, let's just go with England because we're in the United States and the 13 colonies used to be British. England is referred to as the mother country. England had its colonies over in the Americas. What they wanted to do is use the colonies to have a favorable balance of trade and get bullion. So the Europeans, or the English, took raw materials from their colonies like crops, lumber, lots of different things, furs, and they also mined a tremendous amount of, especially silver, in Latin America. So they took those raw materials back to England. In exchange for that, they would take those raw materials, turn them into products. So like they took a lot of lumber from the New World. They took it back to England and turned it into things like furniture. Then they sold those manufactured goods back to their colonies. So the idea of mercantilism is you want to really, really tightly control your colonies and use their economic resources to your advantage. So you might remember from U.S. history that one of the reasons the colonists were so upset in the Americas was that they were not allowed to trade with anyone else but Great Britain. That's mercantilism. That's why England was doing that, because mercantilism says you need to use the resources of your colonies to your advantage. And so if you allow them to trade with other people, then you're not going to be able to do that. All right, 4.3L says economic disputes led to rivalries and conflict between states. So I'll give you some examples. These occurred all throughout the world. The Treaty of Tordesillas from 1494 settled a dispute between Spain and Portugal over the Americas, and it actually drew a line around the globe. So that's why there's two lines here, because it actually goes all the way around the world. And everything to the west of the line was supposed to be for Spain, and everything to the east was supposed to be for Portugal. So if you look at this map in the Americas, you might be kind of wondering, like, why would they agree to this? But it's 1494. They have no idea what these continents look like. And so they agreed to enter into this treaty to try to prevent them from actually going to war against each other. That's another reason why Magellan explored Asia and tried to claim the Philippines for Spain. One of the things he was supposed to do is to figure out where the line here, called the line of demarcation, actually ran and what territory would actually be Spain's. Another example is India. So since the time of Vasco da Gama, both the British, Portuguese, and French claimed sections of India. By the 1800s, through a series of wars, Britain was able to push out its rivals and actually take over India. And you can see like the progression of Britain taking over. Britain is in blue. Another example is the 7 Years' War. So the 7 Years' War is a global conflict that involved fighting in the Americas, in Europe, and Asia between Britain and their allies. So you might remember the French and Indian War from American history, which was the American part of the 7 Years' War. But this is really just fought over global power and over territory throughout the world. 4.1G, the new global circulation of goods was facilitated by chartered European monopoly companies and the global flow of silver. I'm not going to talk about the silver part so much right now because we're going to learn a lot more about that, but it would be good to fill in the European monopoly companies, which are the same ones we just mentioned a little while ago. So that means joint stock company, and those would include the British East India Company and the Dutch VOC. This map shows you the global flow of silver. We're going to talk a lot more about that because soon we're going to be studying Latin America, but you can see as kind of a preview that there were two major silver mines in Latin America that the Spanish drew a tremendous amount of silver from. And that goes back to the principle of mercantilism, that they wanted to get as much gold and silver as they could. So that is an intro to exploration, and we will use those key concepts in our next activity.